The origins of the power struggle between the SS and the Wehrmacht lay in the political and institutional fragmentation of the Third Reich itself. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany's armed forces and paramilitary formations already represented competing visions of national strength. The Reichswehr, limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men, was a professional institution shaped by the traditions of the old Prussian officer corps. It viewed itself as the guardian of the nation's sovereignty, loyal to the state, but wary of political radicalism. By contrast, the Schutzstaffel, originally created in 1925 as a small personal guard unit within the Nazi Party, was built upon ideological loyalty to the Führer and the principles of National Socialism. Its founder, Heinrich Himmler, envisioned it not merely as a protective force, but as an elite political army that would embody the racial and ideological purity of the Nazi movement. From the start, tension was inevitable. The Reichswehr leadership regarded the Nazi Party's paramilitary organizations, especially the SA and later the SS, as threats to professional discipline and command unity. During the early years of Nazi rule, the army still held constitutional authority over Germany's armed power, while the SS remained a party formation under the Ministry of the Interior. Yet the balance of influence began to shift rapidly as Hitler sought to secure his political dominance by manipulating institutional rivalries. He recognized the army's indispensability for rearmament and territorial expansion, but also feared its autonomy. The SS, by contrast, offered ideological loyalty and personal devotion. By fostering competition between the two, Hitler ensured that neither could challenge his supremacy. He made the Night of the Long Knives. In June 1934 marked the first decisive confrontation. The purge eliminated the leadership of the SA, whose ambitions to absorb the army under its revolutionary command had alarmed both the Wehrmacht and conservative elites. In exchange for the army's support, Hitler publicly guaranteed its position as the Reich's sole military institution. Yet the purge also transformed the SS into an independent power. Having carried out the killings, Himmler's organization gained prestige and direct access to the Führer. Within a year, the SS was separated from the SA and placed under Himmler's personal authority, establishing its own police and intelligence networks under Reinhard Heydrich. When the Wehrmacht replaced the Reichswehr in 1935, the formal hierarchy of state defense was restored, but the foundations of dual authority were already set. The Wehrmacht retained command over Germany's conventional military forces, the Army, Navy, and newly established Luftwaffe. However, the SS, through its expanding police and intelligence apparatus, began to intrude into areas previously reserved for military command, such as internal security, counter-espionage, and later, military intelligence. The creation of the SS Verfügungstruppe, special purpose troops, a standing armed formation distinct from the police, further blurred the boundaries. These troops, trained and equipped along military lines, were nominally under the army's supervision, but ideologically and administratively under Himmler's control. The Wehrmacht viewed these developments with suspicion. Senior officers, including Werner von Fritsch and Werner von Blomberg, argued that military authority must remain unified under the general staff. However, the political climate of the Third Reich left them little room to resist. Their removal in 1938 during the Blomberg-Fritsch affair weakened the army's institutional autonomy and allowed Hitler to assume direct command as supreme commander. In the same year, the SS gained full independence from military oversight, and the Waffen-SS began to evolve into a parallel armed force. Ideological indoctrination deepened the divide. The Wehrmacht's leadership still clung to the ethos of traditional professionalism and apolitical service, even as Nazi propaganda sought to align it with racial and ideological goals. The SS, on the other hand, represented the regime's radical vision, a military elite defined by racial purity and total loyalty. While the Wehrmacht viewed warfare in strategic and operational terms, the SS viewed it as a racial crusade. By the late 1930s, the ideological divergence was matched by growing competition for resources, prestige, and influence. The invasion of Poland in 1939 would transform this rivalry into open conflict. The Wehrmacht's command structures, vast and bureaucratic, still dominated military operations, yet SS units, specifically the Totenkopfverbände and Verfügungstruppe, operated alongside regular divisions, conducting security operations that blurred the distinction between military and political authority. Reports from the campaign revealed both the SS's brutality and its independence from army discipline. Wehrmacht officers complained of excesses that endangered order, while Himmler and Heydrich accused the army of lacking ideological commitment. From that point forward, the struggle between the SS and Wehrmacht was no longer theoretical. It had become a defining feature of Nazi Germany's military and political system, a contest over who would command not only the war effort, but the future of the Reich itself. The outbreak of war in September 1939 transformed the balance between the SS and the Wehrmacht from political rivalry into institutional conflict. As German forces invaded Poland, both organizations entered the field with distinct missions and overlapping jurisdictions. The Wehrmacht, comprising nearly 1.5 million men organized into 57 divisions, maintained operational command over the invasion. The SS, however, deployed several specialized formations: the SS Verfügungstruppe, the Totenkopfverbände, and the Einsatzgruppen, which operated alongside the army, but reported directly to Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. While officially under the Wehrmacht's overall authority during the campaign, these units quickly demonstrated their political independence and ideological zeal. The Wehrmacht's generals expected disciplined cooperation, but the SS pursued its own objectives. The Einsatzgruppen conducted mass executions of Polish elites, clergy, and Jewish civilians under the pretext of securing the rear areas. These operations often occurred within Wehrmacht-controlled zones, creating friction between field commanders and SS officers. Reports from generals such as Johannes Blaskowitz condemned the SS's actions as counterproductive and damaging to military discipline. Blaskowitz's memoranda to the High Command detailed instances of indiscriminate shootings and looting, warning that they compromised the army's reputation. His protests, however, were dismissed by Hitler, who sided with Himmler and praised the SS for its political clarity. The outcome set a precedent. The SS's ideological authority outweighed the Wehrmacht's professional objections. The Polish campaign revealed that the two institutions operated on incompatible principles. The Wehrmacht adhered, at least formally, to the conventions of warfare and chain of command. The SS viewed itself as an ideological vanguard tasked with purging and reorganizing society. Their overlapping jurisdictions created a dual system of authority that extended far beyond the battlefield. In occupied Poland, the Wehrmacht retained control over military operations and logistics, while the SS and police assumed responsibility for internal security, intelligence, and population management. This division allowed the SS to expand its reach across the new territories, establishing the foundations of the German occupation system and concentration camp network. Hitler exploited this duality to maintain control. By fostering competition between the SS and Wehrmacht, he ensured neither could challenge his supremacy. The army received resources, prestige, and strategic authority, while the SS gained political influence and direct access to the Führer. Himmler, who became Reichsführer SS and chief of German police, consolidated power over all police forces, including the Gestapo and Kripo, effectively creating a state within a state. The Wehrmacht's leadership, though uneasy, continued to cooperate, believing that loyalty and military success would preserve its institutional autonomy. The early victories in Poland and the West masked the growing structural imbalance. The SS used the aftermath of conquest to justify its expansion. New Waffen-SS divisions were formed from the Verfügungstruppe and foreign volunteers, while the Totenkopf units, originally camp guards, were militarized and deployed in combat roles. By 1940, the Waffen-SS numbered over 100,000 men. Its growing size and propaganda success, portrayed as an elite force embodying National Socialist spirit, threatened the Wehrmacht's traditional dominance. Himmler and Heydrich emphasized ideological discipline over tactical experience, promoting the notion that faith in the Führer could compensate for lack of professional training. During the 1940 campaign in France, tensions resurfaced. Waffen-SS divisions, such as Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitleran Totenkopf, fought alongside regular army units, achieving notable successes but also committing severe breaches of military law, including the execution of prisoners near Wormhout and Le Paradis. Army commanders protested these incidents, but Hitler again shielded the SS from accountability, reinforcing the idea that ideological commitment outweighed military convention. Within months, the SS emerged as both a political and military competitor, its rapid expansion justified by claims of loyalty and purity, while the Army's cautious professionalism appeared outdated. By the time of the Western victory in June 1940, the rivalry between the SS and Wehrmacht had become embedded in the structure of the Nazi state. The army remained indispensable for large-scale warfare, yet the SS had secured a permanent foothold in both military and political affairs. It controlled intelligence through the SD, internal security through the Gestapo, and ideological enforcement through the Waffen-SS. The Wehrmacht's officers, still tied to their oath of loyalty, continued to serve within a system increasingly shaped by the SS's influence. What began as parallel institutions were now competing empires under the same regime, one grounded in tradition and hierarchy, the other in ideology and personal devotion to Hitler. The tension between them would define the next phase of the war, determining not only how Germany fought, but also how it ruled the territories it conquered. By 1941, the internal balance of power within the German war machine had evolved into a complex hierarchy of overlapping authorities. The Wehrmacht, still responsible for overall military operations, found itself increasingly constrained by the parallel rise of the SS and its associated agencies. Heinrich Himmler's power now extended far beyond his original police functions. As Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police, he oversaw not only the Waffen-SS, but also the Ordnungspolizei, the Gestapo, and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD. Together, these institutions formed a vast administrative empire that operated both within and outside the army's jurisdiction. The result was a continuous contest over authority, ideology, and access to Hitler himself, a struggle that intensified with the planning of Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht's senior leadership entered 1941, confident in its operational dominance. The High Command, OKW, and the Army High Command, OKH, directed the coming campaign against the Soviet Union, mobilizing over 3 million troops supported by 600,000 vehicles and nearly 3,500 tanks. Yet, beneath the military planning, the SS and its political apparatus were preparing a parallel operation. The invasion was not only a military campaign, but also a racial and ideological crusade. Himmler, together with Reinhard Heydrich, framed it as a war for the annihilation of Judeo-Bolshevism. To implement this vision, the SS organized the Einsatzgruppen, 4 mobile killing units composed of SS, SD, and police personnel, tasked with securing the rear areas of the advancing Wehrmacht. In theory, these SS formations operated under army authority. In practice, they answered only to Himmler and Heydrich. The Einsatzgruppen followed closely behind the front lines, conducting mass executions of Jews, political commissars, and suspected partisans. Their actions often took place within areas still controlled by Wehrmacht security divisions. While some army officers protested the scale and visibility of these killings, most accepted them as part of anti-partisan warfare. The orders issued by the High Command in advance of the invasion, the Commissar Order and Barbarossa Decree, had already legitimized extra-legal violence. These directives blurred the distinction between military and political objectives, granting both the Wehrmacht and the SS license to pursue ideological warfare. The Wehrmacht's compliance was rooted in a combination of opportunism, ideological convergence, and institutional survival. Many officers shared the regime's anti-communist and nationalist convictions, seeing the SS as a necessary but excessive instrument of policy. At the same time, the army's dependence on Hitler's favor limited its capacity to oppose Himmler's growing influence. Hitler deliberately exploited these dynamics, positioning himself as the sole arbiter between competing institutions. He encouraged the SS's expansion into military roles, arguing that its ideological purity would complement the Wehrmacht's professionalism. To prevent either from becoming too powerful, he maintained overlapping jurisdictions, an administrative chaos that ensured his personal supremacy. As the campaign in the East unfolded, the Waffen-SS emerged as a serious rival to the army in combat capability. Initially numbering only a few divisions, it expanded rapidly after demonstrating resilience and loyalty in the early battles. The Leibstandart, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Wiking divisions were deployed alongside regular army corps during key operations. While they often suffered high casualties due to aggressive tactics, their reputation for fanaticism attracted Hitler's admiration. The Waffen-SS began to receive preferential access to equipment and recruits, despite the Wehrmacht's formal control of mobilization. By late 1942, its strength had grown to more than 250,000 men, and it was officially recognized as a component of the armed forces, though still under Himmler's command. This institutional growth was accompanied by escalating propaganda that contrasted the SS's ideological devotion with the Wehrmacht's perceived conservatism. Himmler portrayed the Waffen-SS as the embodiment of a new, racially unified Europe, recruiting volunteers from across occupied and allied nations. Divisions such as Wiking, Scandinavian, Nordland, Nordic, and Langemarck, Flemish, symbolized this expansion. The Wehrmacht, bound by national tradition and professional restraint, appeared increasingly obsolete in the regime's ideological narrative. Officers resented this shift, but lacked the political leverage to counter it. The more the SS expanded, the more it drew resources, prestige, and manpower away from the army. Competition extended beyond the battlefield into administration and occupation policy. In the vast territories captured in the Soviet Union, overlapping jurisdictions created a permanent state of tension. The Wehrmacht's military governors controlled logistics and supply, while the SS and police directed security operations, population transfers, and the suppression of resistance. Civil authorities, under Alfred Rosenberg's Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, added a third layer of bureaucracy. Each institution pursued its own objectives. The Wehrmacht prioritized order and exploitation for military supply, the SS sought racial reorganization through terror, and Rosenberg's ministry attempted limited civil governance. Hitler encouraged these contradictions, believing that rivalry between subordinates would prevent disloyalty and accelerate radicalization. By 1942, these competing systems had begun to erode the Wehrmacht's operational efficiency. Supply shortages, partisan warfare, and the logistical demands of total occupation strained army resources. The SS exploited the situation by expanding its influence over rear area security. Himmler created the Higher SS and Police Leaders (HSSPF) system, establishing regional command structures that superseded army authority in occupied zones. These officers coordinated all SS, police, and auxiliary forces, answering directly to Himmler and bypassing the military chain of command. In practice, this meant that Wehrmacht commanders had to cooperate or compete with SS officials who wielded both political backing and their own armed formations. Within Germany, the SS's institutional reach extended into the army's internal affairs. The Gestapo monitored officers for signs of dissent, while the SD infiltrated intelligence and counterintelligence networks. The Abwehr, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, became a particular target. Himmler distrusted the Abwehr's conservative ethos and sought to replace it with the SS's own Sicherheitsdienst intelligence service. By 1944, the Abwehr was dissolved entirely, and its functions were absorbed into the SS-controlled Reich Security Main Office, RSHA. This represented one of Himmler's most decisive victories in his struggle against the Wehrmacht's traditional autonomy. Despite this encroachment, the army retained one crucial advantage: scale. The Wehrmacht remained the backbone of Germany's war effort, fielding millions of soldiers across multiple fronts. The SS, though powerful, could not replace it. Himmler's strategy was therefore gradual co-optation rather than confrontation. He positioned the SS as both a complement and a corrective to the army, claiming that its ideological commitment compensated for the Wehrmacht's alleged lack of revolutionary zeal. This argument appealed to Hitler, who increasingly viewed the army's officer corps as politically unreliable. The tension between the two institutions thus became a reflection of the regime's broader contradictions. The Wehrmacht sought to preserve its identity as a professional military force while serving a totalitarian state that demanded ideological conformity. The SS, by contrast, defined itself entirely through ideology, yet sought the legitimacy of military achievement. Their rivalry produced a hybrid system, one in which military efficiency and political fanaticism coexisted uneasily, often undermining one another. The Wehrmacht's battlefield successes temporarily masked this instability, but beneath the surface, the foundations of unified command were disintegrating. As the war dragged on, the overlapping ambitions of the SS and the Wehrmacht would increasingly collide, not only over military authority, but over the very question of who represented the German state. Himmler's power reached its peak as the tide of war began to turn, setting the stage for open confrontation between ideological loyalty and institutional survival. The struggle between the two forces, one rooted in centuries of military tradition, the other born from the radicalism of a totalitarian movement, was about to determine not only the conduct of the war, but the fate of the regime itself. The summer of 1941 marked the point at which the power struggle between the SS and the Wehrmacht erupted into daily reality on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had begun as a unified campaign under the Wehrmacht's command, but within weeks it revealed two parallel wars, one strategic and military, the other ideological and political. In theory, the Wehrmacht led the invasion through three army groups, North, Center, and South, supported by Luftwaffe and armored formations totaling more than 3 million men. In practice, however, the SS pursued its own objectives within the same operational space. Himmler's Einsatzgruppen and Waffen-SS divisions advanced immediately behind army lines, conducting mass executions, security operations, and racial cleansing under directives that bypassed the high command. At first, cooperation was superficial. Wehrmacht field commanders tolerated SS activities as long as they did not interfere with logistics or discipline. Many officers, sharing the regime's anti-communist ideology, regarded these operations as a grim necessity. Yet tensions surfaced as the scale of violence grew. Reports from army units in Ukraine and Belarus described the killing of tens of thousands of Jews and civilians in areas designated as secured. Generals such as Hermann Hoth and Gerd von Rundstedt expressed concern that indiscriminate shootings would fuel partisan resistance. The SS, however, framed these killings as preventive measures. Orders from Himmler emphasized that the political cleansing of the East was integral to the war effort. The Wehrmacht's high command, unwilling to challenge Hitler's vision, allowed the SS to continue unimpeded. As the invasion advanced, the Waffen-SS expanded its operational role. Its divisions, including Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, fought alongside Army Corps in some of the bloodiest engagements of the early campaign. The SS's aggressive tactics earned both admiration and resentment. Its commanders, many of whom lacked formal military training, often disregarded orders or overextended positions in pursuit of prestige. At Demyansk and Smolensk, Army officers complained that SS units refused to cooperate with established command procedures, prioritizing political theater over tactical coordination. Yet, Hitler valued these formations precisely for their defiance. He saw in their fanaticism a model for transforming the entire German military into an ideologically unified force. Behind the front, the SS's influence deepened through administrative control. Himmler's higher SS and police leaders established regional authority over occupied territories, coordinating with civilian governors and sometimes overriding army commands. In the Baltic states, Ukraine, and parts of Belarus, the SS controlled intelligence, population registration, and the deportation of Jews to ghettos or killing sites. The Wehrmacht's role in these areas became increasingly logistical, securing transport, providing labor, and maintaining order. In official communications, cooperation between the two forces was described as mutual assistance, but in reality, it represented the gradual subordination of the Army to SS policy. The ideological conflict extended into questions of prestige. The Waffen-SS presented itself as an elite formation of political soldiers, contrasting its racial and ideological purity with what Himmler portrayed as the Wehrmacht's outdated professionalism. Propaganda films and illustrated magazines glorified the SS as the embodiment of the new German warrior, modern, ruthless, and devoted to Hitler alone. Wehrmacht officers, by contrast, were depicted as traditionalists, loyal to procedure rather than faith. This image resonated with younger recruits, especially as the Waffen-SS opened its ranks to volunteers from across occupied Europe. By 1942, it had become a multinational force, claiming to represent a racially unified European army under German leadership. The Wehrmacht attempted to counter this ideological encroachment through its own propaganda emphasizing discipline, technical skill, and sacrifice. Yet these appeals lacked political force. Hitler's growing distrust of the army's leadership, combined with Himmler's relentless expansionism, eroded its authority. After the defeats before Moscow in late 1941, Hitler publicly blamed army commanders for defeatism and overcaution. The SS capitalized on this moment to portray itself as the only force maintaining faith in ultimate victory. Within months, Himmler gained approval to raise new Waffen-SS divisions, further reducing the Wehrmacht's share of elite manpower and resources. Tensions between the two institutions were also reflected in the treatment of occupied populations. The Wehrmacht's economic offices sought to exploit the occupied Soviet territories for resources, grain, and labor. The SS, pursuing racial objectives, prioritized extermination and resettlement. These conflicting priorities led to constant disputes over control of railways, manpower, and requisitioning. In practice, however, both institutions cooperated when interests aligned. The Army needed the SS's police apparatus to suppress uprisings and maintain supply routes, while the SS relied on Wehrmacht transport and infrastructure to carry out deportations and mass killings. The division between them, though real, operated within a shared ideological framework of domination and racial hierarchy. The war in the East thus became a laboratory for institutional rivalry. Each success or failure was used as political leverage. The SS sought to prove its worth through fanaticism. The Wehrmacht tried to maintain its primacy through experience and numbers. Yet, by 1942, it was clear that ideological zeal carried more weight in Hitler's calculations than professionalism. Himmler's presence at the Führer's headquarters and his growing control over intelligence, police, and security made him indispensable. The Army's command, increasingly defensive and demoralized, found itself trapped between operational necessity and political submission. The early campaigns in the Soviet Union had therefore transformed the internal structure of Nazi Germany's armed power. The Wehrmacht remained the executor of large-scale operations, but the SS had embedded itself in every aspect of warfare, from frontline combat to occupation policy and mass extermination. The boundaries between them continued to erode, setting the stage for a deeper confrontation, the moment when the SS would no longer merely compete with the Wehrmacht, but begin to absorb its functions entirely. By 1942, the rivalry between the SS and the Wehrmacht had evolved into a contest for dominance over the German war machine itself. The turning point came with the transition from rapid conquest to attritional warfare on the Eastern Front. As the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain its momentum after the failed advance on Moscow, Heinrich Himmler and his apparatus seized the opportunity to expand the SS's reach into areas traditionally controlled by the Army. The Waffen-SS, initially subordinate in size and experience, now became a rapidly growing military force, while the SS's administrative and police branches tightened their hold on occupation policy, internal security, and intelligence. The Wehrmacht, though still numerically superior, was steadily losing influence both on the battlefield and within the state's political hierarchy. The deteriorating situation in the East prompted Hitler to place greater emphasis on ideological discipline rather than strategic flexibility. Himmler presented the SS as the embodiment of this ideal, a formation of politically reliable soldiers immune to defeatism. The expansion of the Waffen-SS was authorized at the highest level. From barely 150,000 men in early 1942, its strength would grow to over 500,000 by the end of 1943. New divisions such as Das Reich, Wehrmacht, Totenkopf, and Leibstandarte received modern tanks, artillery, and priority access to replacements, often at the expense of regular army units. Recruitment extended to Germanic volunteers from occupied and allied countries, Dutch, Norwegians, Danes, Flemings, and later Croatians and Ukrainians, further reinforcing the SS's claim to represent an international crusade against Bolshevism. The Wehrmacht leadership, though resentful of these privileges, could do little to resist. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, both loyal to Hitler, facilitated the Waffen-SS's expansion through the High Command. Protests from senior generals, most notably Gerd von Rundstedt and Erich von Manstein, were ignored or dismissed as signs of elitist conservatism. The SS, through Himmler's direct access to the Führer, operated above the army's bureaucratic constraints. The result was dual command on nearly every front. SS Corps fought under nominal Wehrmacht supervision, but maintained their own administrative, logistical, and disciplinary systems. The rivalry also extended into intelligence and counterespionage. The Wehrmacht's Abwehr, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, remained one of the few institutions outside SS control. Himmler viewed it with suspicion, accusing it of harboring anti-Nazi elements and inefficiency. His security service, SD, began a systematic campaign to undermine and absorb it. Reports from the SD alleged that Abwehr officers were leaking information and sabotaging the war effort. In 1943, after prolonged internal maneuvering, the Abwehr was dismantled and its responsibilities transferred to the SS-controlled Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, under Ernst Kaltenbrunner. This marked a decisive moment in the power struggle. The Wehrmacht had lost its independent intelligence service, and with it, much of its institutional autonomy. On the battlefield, cooperation between SS and Army formations remained uneasy. The Waffen-SS's combat reputation grew, particularly during defensive operations such as the relief attempts at Kharkov in 1943. Their willingness to counterattack under extreme conditions earned admiration from Hitler and from some frontline soldiers, even as traditional officers criticized their heavy losses and disregard for tactical prudence. The SS's aggressive doctrine emphasized initiative and personal courage, which often translated into high casualty rates but provided powerful propaganda material. The Wehrmacht's professionalism, by contrast, appeared cautious and old-fashioned in the regime's ideological narrative. The SS's role in occupied territories further expanded its political leverage. Himmler's system of higher SS and police leaders, HSSPF, effectively governed large parts of Eastern Europe, coordinating anti-partisan warfare, forced labor programs, and deportations. The Wehrmacht's own security divisions were nominally responsible for rear area control, but were compelled to cooperate with SS-led operations. Anti-partisan campaigns in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Balkans blurred distinctions between military and police actions. Entire villages were destroyed, populations deported, and tens of thousands executed under joint SS-Wehrmacht operations. While the army often sought to justify these measures as necessary to maintain order, the SS used them to demonstrate its efficiency in enforcing Hitler's ideological goals. As Germany's strategic situation worsened in late 1942 and early 1943, Himmler positioned himself as a political counterweight to the army's high command. Following the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler's trust in his generals eroded further. The Führer began to rely increasingly on SS officers for advice and morale, inviting commanders such as Sepp Dietrich and Felix Steiner to personal briefings. The Waffen-SS, untouched by the stigma of Stalingrad, emerged as the symbol of unbreakable faith. Himmler capitalized on this perception to secure greater control over replacement manpower, training schools, and armaments. Even the Waffenamt, the Army's ordnance office, was pressured to prioritize SS divisions in equipment allocations. By 1943, the power struggle had shifted decisively in favor of the SS. Although the Wehrmacht remained essential for large-scale operations, its institutional identity had been compromised. Officers increasingly operated under political scrutiny. Ideological loyalty now outweighed competence as the criterion for promotion. The SS, with its parallel command system, intelligence monopoly, and propaganda apparatus, had become the dominant force within the Nazi state's machinery of war. Yet this dominance came at a cost. The fragmentation of authority undermined operational coherence and contributed to Germany's strategic decline. The relationship between the SS and the Wehrmacht by this stage was no longer one of competition alone. It was symbiosis under tension. The SS required the army's logistical depth and industrial support to sustain its expansion, while the Wehrmacht needed the SS's political favor to maintain access to Hitler. Their rivalry, carefully managed by the Führer, ensured mutual dependence, but also ensured that neither could exercise true autonomy. This unstable equilibrium would persist until the final years of the war, when defeat and desperation forced the two institutions into an uneasy alliance under the collapsing structures of the Third Reich. By 1943, the rivalry between the SS and the Wehrmacht had become one of the defining internal conflicts of the Nazi war effort. The Wehrmacht, still responsible for the bulk of combat operations, was increasingly entangled in a political system designed to erode its autonomy. The SS, meanwhile, had reached the height of its institutional power. Heinrich Himmler controlled not only the Waffen-SS and police forces, but also the vast intelligence apparatus of the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, and an expanding network of concentration and labor camps. This accumulation of authority transformed the SS into a hybrid organization, military, political, and economic, whose influence now extended deep into the Wehrmacht's traditional domains. The aftermath of Stalingrad provided Himmler with unprecedented opportunities. Hitler's faith in the professional officer corps had been shaken, and he sought ideological reassurance rather than strategic innovation. Himmler presented the Waffen-SS as the model for this new kind of soldier, fanatically loyal, racially pure, and politically dependable. As the Wehrmacht reeled from losses on the Eastern Front, the Waffen-SS expanded to fill the gap. By the summer of 1943, its divisions numbered more than 30, incorporating not only Germanic volunteers, but also recruits from southeastern and eastern Europe. The creation of divisions such as Handschar, Bosnian, Prinz Eugen, Volksdeutsche from the Balkans, and Galician, Ukrainian, reflected the SS's growing role as both an ideological army and a colonial instrument of occupation policy. The Wehrmacht viewed these developments with skepticism and unease. While the SS claimed to be supplementing German military strength, its multinational recruitment diluted the principle of national command. Officers of the General Staff worried that the presence of politically indoctrinated formations, loyal directly to Himmler, undermined the unity of the front. Yet open opposition was nearly impossible. Hitler's patronage of the SS meant that even mild criticism risked political ruin. Those who voiced dissent, such as Field Marshal Manstein, who questioned the deployment of Waffen-SS divisions during the Battle of Kursk, found themselves marginalized or dismissed. The SS's proximity to Hitler ensured that its influence grew precisely as the army's credibility declined. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented both a military and symbolic moment in the rivalry. Three of the SS's elite divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, formed the core of 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser. The offensive's limited tactical success, followed by massive losses, did little to alter the strategic situation. But it elevated the Waffen-SS's prestige. Hitler praised their determination and used the event to contrast their ideological courage with what he described as the army's defensive mentality. Propaganda emphasized the SS's role as the spearhead of the German counterattack, turning military failure into ideological victory. The Wehrmacht's more measured accounts were suppressed, while the SS emerged as the regime's heroic face in an increasingly desperate war. Beyond the battlefield, Himmler's control of occupied territories expanded dramatically. As Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Nationhood, he directed population transfers, resettlements, and the exploitation of forced labor. SS economic enterprises such as the Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke and the DEST construction projects operated under the protection of Wehrmacht logistics and transport systems. Army engineers built railways and roads that supplied both frontline units and concentration camps. This cooperation, driven by necessity rather than ideological unity, blurred institutional boundaries. The Wehrmacht's logistical apparatus became indirectly complicit in SS economic and exterminatory activities, even as its officers maintained formal distance from the system of camps and deportations. Inside Germany, the SS also began encroaching upon the Wehrmacht's domestic prerogatives. Himmler's police apparatus monitored the morale of soldiers and civilians alike, intercepting letters and investigating alleged defeatism. Military courts were pressured to align with SS standards of punishment. The introduction of flying courts-martial, authorized by Hitler in 1944 but prepared earlier, reflected this convergence of military and police justice. The Wehrmacht's internal disciplinary mechanisms, once the hallmark of professional autonomy, were now intertwined with political surveillance. Himmler's ideology of total obedience had penetrated the officer corps, transforming the concept of military duty into one of unconditional ideological submission. Even in logistics and production, the SS challenged the Army's primacy. The Waffen-SS created its own recruitment offices, training schools, and supply depots, effectively duplicating Army structures. Its economic independence was further reinforced through direct ties with Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments, which prioritized SS formations for new weapons and equipment. The Army's traditional procurement agencies struggled to compete, often forced to negotiate for resources previously under their control. This bureaucratic fragmentation, encouraged by Hitler, ensured that the SS's political loyalty outweighed the Wehrmacht's organizational efficiency. By late 1943, the consequences of this rivalry were evident on every front. Coordination between Army and SS formations deteriorated, especially in multi-branch operations. Conflicting chains of command delayed decisions, wasted resources, and created confusion in crisis situations. In the Balkans, for example, anti-partisan operations conducted jointly by the Wehrmacht and SS units degenerated into uncoordinated campaigns of terror that alienated local populations and intensified resistance. Similar friction arose in Italy after the fall of Mussolini, where both institutions competed for control over disarmament of Italian forces and administration of occupied zones. Yet, despite its growing influence, the SS remained dependent on the Wehrmacht's infrastructure. Its divisions relied on army transport, fuel, and ammunition. Its commanders were trained in Wehrmacht academies. Its field hospitals were staffed by army medical personnel. The relationship was therefore paradoxical. The SS could not fully replace the Wehrmacht, but it had succeeded in hollowing out its autonomy. The army still carried the burden of total war, while the SS reaped the political rewards. By the end of 1943, the balance within the Nazi state had shifted irreversibly. The Wehrmacht, weakened by attrition and internal distrust, had lost its claim to represent Germany's military tradition. The SS had become the ideological core of the regime's war effort. Its soldiers hailed as the future model of the German fighting man, its bureaucracy entrenched across Europe. The power struggle that had begun as a competition for influence was now entering its final stage. The SS's attempt to transform dominance into full control over the collapsing war machine, even as defeat loomed on the horizon. By early 1944, the rivalry between the SS and the Wehrmacht had reached its most intense and destructive phase. The German war effort, weakened by defeats in the East and the Allied advance in Italy, faced an internal war of authority. Both institutions claimed to represent the essence of Hitler's vision, one through professional command and operational tradition, the other through ideological purity and direct loyalty. In practice, their struggle for dominance accelerated the disintegration of the regime's military coherence. Himmler's rise to near-autonomous power coincided with the Wehrmacht's steady erosion. As the front lines contracted, the SS's grip expanded. The Waffen-SS, now numbering nearly 600,000 men, organized into 38 divisions, was no longer a peripheral force but a parallel army. These divisions, though variable in quality, symbolized the political militarization of the state. Their recruitment drew on the remains of shattered Wehrmacht units, Nazi youth organizations, and foreign volunteers from across occupied Europe. For Hitler, this army of ideological soldiers embodied the racial and spiritual resilience that traditional officers, in his view, lacked. The Wehrmacht's generals watched with growing frustration as the SS encroached upon their commands. Himmler's higher SS and police leaders, HSSPF, were now embedded across occupied Europe, controlling local security, deportations, and forced labor. Even in purely military zones, SS units operated with relative independence. Reports from the Eastern Front recorded repeated conflicts between field commanders and SS officers over jurisdiction, logistics, and tactics. At the same time, the SS's political networks extended deep into the army's structure. Propaganda officers and party liaison units monitored the conduct of generals and ensured ideological conformity within the ranks. The tension became especially visible in the wake of the failed Battle of Kursk and the Soviet counteroffensives that followed. The Wehrmacht's command culture, based on strategic analysis and defensive adaptation, clashed with Hitler's insistence on ideological steadfastness. Himmler and the SS reinforced this attitude by denouncing any talk of withdrawal as cowardice. When Field Marshal von Kluge proposed tactical retreats to shorten the front in 1944, SS representatives in Hitler's headquarters accused him of defeatism. Within months, Kluge was replaced by loyalists more aligned with the SS worldview. Hitler's reliance on Himmler and his officers deepened. He viewed them as incorruptible instruments of willpower, amid what he perceived as an increasingly unreliable army elite. In February 1944, Himmler achieved one of his greatest political victories. He was appointed commander of the replacement army, a position that gave him control over recruitment, training, and the reserve system. This post had previously belonged to the Wehrmacht's internal structure, serving as the central mechanism for replenishing frontline divisions. With Himmler in charge, the SS gained direct access to manpower and could prioritize its own formations over those of the army. The Wehrmacht was forced to negotiate for replacements, a situation unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Himmler also used this authority to extend political indoctrination in the training camps, ensuring that every new recruit underwent ideological conditioning before joining any unit. The relationship between the two institutions deteriorated further after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944. The plot, which originated within elements of the Army's officer corps, gave Himmler the opportunity to strike decisively at his rival. The SS and Gestapo launched a massive purge of the Wehrmacht, arresting more than 7,000 officers and executing hundreds, including some of the regime's most experienced commanders. The Ersatzheer, the replacement army, was placed under direct SS control, and military courts were reorganized under SS supervision. For the first time, the army's internal justice system was subordinated to political authority. Himmler's control over this process allowed him to present the SS as the guardian of the Führer's safety and the ideological heart of the Reich, while the Wehrmacht was portrayed as a breeding ground for treachery and defeatism. The consequences were profound. The Wehrmacht lost not only its remaining political influence, but also its institutional coherence. Many officers, fearing surveillance and denunciation, avoided independent decision-making, while others aligned themselves with SS ideology to preserve their positions. At the same time, the Waffen-SS's presence at the front increased dramatically. Entire sectors in the east and west were now commanded by SS Corps, while army divisions were reorganized under mixed SS-Wehrmacht commands. The boundaries between the two blurred, but the SS's ideological authority always prevailed. Himmler's ambition extended beyond the battlefield. He envisioned a post-war order in which the SS would become the nucleus of a new aristocracy, replacing the old Prussian officer class. This vision was reflected in the SS's structure. Its schools, research institutes, and racial offices were designed to create an elite defined by ideological conviction rather than lineage. The Wehrmacht, steeped in older traditions of duty and hierarchy, could not compete with this revolutionary narrative. Even as the SS's military performance declined under the pressure of Allied advances, its political control tightened. By the second half of 1944, Germany's military collapse exposed the contradictions of the system. The SS's autonomy and the Wehrmacht's fragmentation led to chaos in command. Parallel orders from different headquarters caused operational paralysis. In Normandy, conflicting instructions between Field Marshal von Kluge's army group and SS panzer commanders delayed counterattacks and contributed to the encirclement at Falaise. Similar confusion plagued the defense of Warsaw during the uprising in August 1944, where Himmler personally directed SS and police units with little coordination with army commands. These failures illustrated that ideological loyalty had replaced strategic coherence as the basis of military action. The Wehrmacht's final subjugation was completed by Hitler himself. Disillusioned with his generals, he increasingly entrusted key commands to SS officers. Himmler was appointed commander of Army Group Vistula in early 1945, despite his lack of operational experience. The decision symbolized the complete political eclipse of the army. Although Himmler's performance as a field commander was disastrous, his appointment demonstrated Hitler's preference for ideological reliability over competence. The Wehrmacht, reduced to a logistical backbone, was now subordinate in both fact and spirit. By the end of 1944, the German war effort was sustained not by coordination, but by the coercive fusion of two decaying institutions. The Wehrmacht's vast administrative machinery continued to fight because the SS enforced discipline through surveillance and terror. The SS, for its part, relied on the army's organization and logistics to maintain its military and exterminatory operations. Their rivalry, once a competition for influence, had evolved into a relationship of mutual dependence in decline. Both institutions, drained by defeat and corrupted by ideology, were now extensions of a collapsing totalitarian state. The year 1944 thus represented both the SS's triumph and the Wehrmacht's final submission. Himmler had achieved near-total political control over the German armed forces, but at the cost of unity and effectiveness. The army that had once been Europe's most formidable instrument of war was now fragmented, demoralized, and policed by its supposed ally. The SS, victorious in its internal struggle, had inherited a battlefield empire in ruins, its ideological ascendancy assured, but its practical victory hollow, built upon the wreckage of the very system it had sought to dominate. In early 1945, as Germany faced inevitable defeat, the rivalry between the SS and the Wehrmacht entered its final and most chaotic stage. The once carefully managed balance of power that Hitler had maintained collapsed under the pressure of encirclement, destruction, and internal distrust. The Wehrmacht, still responsible for large-scale operations on multiple fronts, was now hollowed out, its command authority undermined by political intrusion, its discipline enforced by fear, and its strategic initiative replaced by directives issued directly from the Führer's bunker. The SS, now deeply embedded within every layer of the state, exercised near-total ideological and police control. Yet even as Himmler's influence reached its peak, his institution began to fracture under the same conditions that had consumed the army: exhaustion, disillusionment, and loss of purpose. The final months of the war revealed how profoundly the SS-Wehrmacht struggle had eroded Germany's ability to wage war coherently. Himmler's appointment as commander of Army Group Vistula in January 1945 symbolized the extent of the army's degradation. Despite having no real operational experience, Himmler was entrusted with halting the Soviet advance toward Berlin. His headquarters was a mixture of SS officers, political advisors, and hastily assembled army staff. Coordination between units was almost non-existent. Reports from the front described confusion in orders, overlapping jurisdictions, and frequent bypassing of army procedures. The Wehrmacht's officers, trained in systematic command, found themselves overruled by ideologues who substituted willpower for strategy. Within weeks, Himmler's command collapsed, and he was quietly removed from military duties. This episode epitomized the consequences of years of internal rivalry. The Army's professional command culture had been dismantled, while the SS's ideological confidence proved militarily worthless. Nevertheless, the SS's presence at the front remained significant. Waffen-SS divisions formed part of the defensive lines in East Prussia, Hungary, and the approaches to Berlin. They fought with determination, but without coordination, often receiving direct orders from Hitler that bypassed army headquarters. In the Ardennes offensive in late 1944, the SS's 6th Panzer Army had already demonstrated this dysfunction. Its aggressive tactics and refusal to coordinate with army units contributed to logistical collapse. Similar failures recurred on the Eastern Front, where mixed formations of Army and SS units operated under competing chains of command. Inside the Reich, the SS's control over internal security became absolute. Following the July 20th plot and the ensuing purges, the Wehrmacht's autonomy had been completely erased. Military governors were subordinated to SS and police leaders, while the Gestapo extended surveillance into every branch of the armed forces. Deserters and civilians suspected of defeatism were executed publicly, often by SS firing squads, to maintain what the regime called fanatical resistance. The SS's ideology of total loyalty had replaced strategic reason as the final organizing principle of the German war effort. By 1945, the distinction between political enforcement and military command had effectively disappeared. The Wehrmacht, however, continued to function as a massive, decaying mechanism. Despite catastrophic losses, millions dead, hundreds of thousands captured, and entire formations destroyed, it retained remnants of operational discipline. Field commanders like Walter Wenck, Ferdinand Schörner, and Gotthard Heinrici tried to conduct orderly retreats and defend civilian corridors. Yet even their efforts were constantly undermined by SS intervention. Himmler's subordinates, including high-ranking police leaders and SS generals, ordered summary executions of officers accused of defeatism for suggesting withdrawal or negotiation. This atmosphere of terror ensured obedience but destroyed morale. As Soviet and Western Allied armies advanced into German territory, the competition for control of the collapsing state intensified. The Wehrmacht's administrative apparatus still controlled vast depots, supply networks, and communication lines, but the SS used its police and intelligence forces to seize critical infrastructure and archives. The Waffen-SS attempted to portray itself as the true defender of the Reich's honor, while Wehrmacht officers increasingly viewed continued resistance as senseless. The rift widened into open hostility in some regions. In Bavaria and northern Germany, army commanders ignored SS directives to continue fighting and sought to surrender to Western forces. SS units responded by arresting or executing those who disobeyed Hitler's orders. Himmler, aware that Germany's defeat was imminent, began to act independently of Hitler. In March and April 1945, he secretly attempted to negotiate with the Western Allies through intermediaries in Sweden. His overtures revealed a final irony in the SS-Wehrmacht conflict. While he had spent years undermining the army's professionalism and loyalty, he now tried to imitate the same pragmatism he had once condemned. When Hitler discovered these negotiations, he stripped Himmler of all titles and expelled him from the party. For the first time, the SS found itself divided internally, between those who remained loyal to the Führer and those seeking to survive. The final collapse of the Wehrmacht and the SS in April-May 1945 was not a unified surrender, but a disjointed series of capitulations. Some Waffen-SS units, like Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend, continued to fight until the fall of Berlin, refusing to surrender. Others attempted to escape westward to avoid Soviet captivity. Wehrmacht formations, meanwhile, surrendered in large numbers, prioritizing the preservation of life over obedience to ideology. In the ruins of Berlin, the remnants of both institutions fought side by side, but with little cooperation, an alliance born of desperation rather than unity. When the Reich capitulated on May 8, 1945, the power struggle that had defined its military structure died with it. The SS had achieved total political control only to oversee total military ruin. The Wehrmacht, stripped of independence and corrupted by ideological compromise, no longer resembled the professional army it had once been. Both institutions had consumed each other. The SS's dominance destroyed the Wehrmacht's effectiveness, while the army's compliance enabled the SS's crimes. Their rivalry, built on loyalty to the same dictator, ended not in triumph for either side, but in mutual collapse. In the aftermath, Allied investigators would find the administrative traces of this internal war: duplicate orders, conflicting reports, and contradictory command chains. The Nazi regime's military failure was not merely a consequence of external defeat, but of internal disunity and ideological distortion. The SS's victory within the Reich had been Pyrrhic. It had inherited command over a nation already lost. The Wehrmacht's final surrender, once a symbol of order, now marked the disintegration of a state that had destroyed its own institutions in the pursuit of total control. The collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945 brought not only the end of Germany's military power, but also the dissolution of the two rival institutions that had defined its internal struggle, the SS and the Wehrmacht. Their fates, however, diverged sharply in the immediate aftermath of defeat. The Wehrmacht, as the official armed force of Germany, became the primary target of Allied disarmament and surrender procedures. The SS, on the other hand, was designated from the outset as a criminal organization, an apparatus of repression, terror, and genocide. Yet despite these legal distinctions, both institutions faced a common reckoning: exposure, fragmentation, and denial. What had begun as a competition for authority ended with each trying to escape the consequences of the system they had served. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the Wehrmacht's remnants capitulated piecemeal to the Allied powers. More than 7 million soldiers were taken prisoner by American, British, Soviet, and French forces. Most were processed as conventional POWs, although higher-ranking officers were interrogated about their role in Nazi policies and cooperation with the SS. The Wehrmacht's internal narrative, carefully cultivated during the war, now served as a defensive strategy. Many officers claimed that they had been professionals detached from politics, obeying lawful orders without participating in ideological crimes. This distinction between honorable soldiers and criminal SS quickly took root in public perception, particularly in the western zones of occupation. The Allies, preoccupied with the emerging Cold War, often reinforced this division by rehabilitating Wehrmacht expertise for reconstruction and intelligence purposes. The SS, by contrast, could not separate itself from its crimes. The Allied Control Council outlawed all branches of the organization, including the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, and the SD. Over 200,000 SS members were arrested in the first year after the war, though only a small percentage faced trial. The Nuremberg trials established the SS's role as the central instrument of racial policy and state terror. Prosecutors presented documents showing its direct involvement in mass murder, forced labor, and the operation of concentration camps. Testimony from captured officers detailed the SS's domination of the war economy, its coordination with the Wehrmacht in security operations, and its role in enforcing ideological conformity across occupied Europe. The organization was declared criminal in its entirety, a judgment that made no distinction between combat and administrative branches. For former Waffen-SS soldiers, this verdict was devastating. Many had fought on front lines alongside army units and viewed themselves as soldiers rather than political agents. In prisoner camps, they argued that the Waffen-SS had been a purely military formation, distinct from the concentration camp system. This claim, though partially accepted by some Allied officers, was contradicted by evidence of atrocities committed by SS divisions in France, the Soviet Union, and the Balkans. Nonetheless, the perception of the Waffen-SS as a fourth branch of the Wehrmacht persisted, particularly among veterans who sought to distance themselves from the crimes of the broader SS network. The Wehrmacht's senior leadership also benefited from this emerging separation. During the Nuremberg proceedings, figures such as Wilhelm Keidel, Alfred Jodl, and Erich Raeder were tried for war crimes, yet the prosecution focused primarily on high-level planning and the conduct of aggressive war, rather than ideological participation. This approach reinforced the notion that the army had been manipulated by Hitler and the SS, rather than acting as a willing partner. In post-war memoirs, generals like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian depicted the Wehrmacht as a professional institution corrupted from above. These narratives, emphasizing technical competence and patriotic duty, shaped early Cold War historiography and helped rehabilitate the image of the German soldier in the West. In contrast, Soviet authorities treated both institutions as instruments of fascist aggression. In the East, captured Wehrmacht and SS personnel were interned in forced labor camps, with little distinction between them. The Red Army's investigations emphasized the Wehrmacht's complicity in war crimes on Soviet territory, including participation in mass shootings, sieges, and deportations. Soviet propaganda rejected the Western narrative of a clean army, portraying the Wehrmacht and SS as two faces of the same imperialist project. This dichotomy between East and West would shape the memory of the war in Europe for decades. Within Germany itself, the disintegration of both the SS and the Wehrmacht created a vacuum in national identity. Millions of veterans returned to a devastated country, stripped of institutions that had defined their sense of duty and belonging. The Allied occupation authorities dismantled the remnants of the military establishment, while denazification processes sought to purge former SS members from public life. Yet the boundaries of guilt and responsibility were difficult to define. In many communities, returning soldiers concealed their pasts or claimed ignorance of atrocities. The sheer scale of the war made individual accountability nearly impossible to enforce. By the late 1940s, the emerging geopolitical divide accelerated the rehabilitation of the Wehrmacht in the West. The foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949 and the formation of the Bundeswehr 6 years later required a usable military tradition. Former Wehrmacht officers were recruited to advise on organization and strategy, while the SS remained excluded. In East Germany, the opposite occurred. The Wehrmacht was officially condemned as a capitalist tool, while the communist states celebrated anti-fascist resistance. Both German states, for political reasons, simplified the past, either by separating the army from the SS or by merging their guilt into a single narrative of fascism. In the ruins of 1945, the rivalry that had once defined the Nazi regime ended in mutual destruction but left behind two very different legacies. The Wehrmacht survived in memory as a reformed military tradition, its crimes partially obscured by Cold War politics. The SS, annihilated institutionally and morally, became the symbol of the regime's totalitarian violence. Yet, historically, their roles had been intertwined. The SS could not have expanded without the Wehrmacht's cooperation, and the Wehrmacht could not have functioned without the ideological framework enforced by the SS. Their final coexistence and collapse, one seeking survival through denial, the other condemned by its own fanaticism, reflected the ultimate failure of a system that had fused politics and war into a single, self-destructive enterprise. The legacy of the power struggle between the SS and the Wehrmacht extends far beyond the collapse of the Third Reich. It reshaped the political, moral, and historical understanding of Germany's 20th century past, and left unresolved questions about authority, obedience, and ideology in modern warfare. In the decades following 1945, both institutions became symbols of the contradictions within the Nazi system, one representing the professional tradition corrupted by politics, the other the political ideology weaponized through militarization. Their interaction demonstrated how a modern state could destroy its own effectiveness by merging the instruments of war with the machinery of ideological control. In the immediate post-war years, the Allied powers confronted the challenge of documenting and judging the Nazi regime's crimes. The Nuremberg trials provided the legal framework for understanding the relationship between the SS and the Wehrmacht. The SS was condemned as a criminal organization for its direct role in genocide, forced labor, and mass repression. The Wehrmacht, while not collectively indicted, was implicated through individual trials of senior officers and the production of captured documents. Yet the distinction between criminal and conventional warfare proved difficult to sustain. Evidence from operational reports, orders, and correspondence revealed deep collaboration between the two forces in the East, shared logistics, coordinated anti-partisan operations, and joint planning of population policies. The The legal separation between them was thus more political than historical. Over the following decades, the image of the Wehrmacht evolved through competing narratives. In West Germany, early historians and veterans organizations promoted the concept of the saubere Wehrmacht, the clean army, arguing that the regular military had fought with honor while the SS had committed atrocities. This narrative, useful for reintegration and the rearmament of West Germany during the Cold War, allowed former officers to participate in rebuilding the Bundeswehr. It also served Western strategic interests by distinguishing the professional German military tradition from Nazism. However, as declassified archives and new scholarship emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, this distinction collapsed. Studies revealed that the Wehrmacht had participated directly in war crimes, including the execution of prisoners, starvation policies during the siege of Leningrad, and cooperation with the Einsatzgruppen. The clean army myth became one of post-war Europe's most enduring and contested historical illusions. In contrast, the SS never benefited from rehabilitation. Its ideological foundation was inseparable from the crimes it committed. The Waffen-SS, despite veterans' efforts to portray it as an apolitical fighting force, remained indelibly linked to the Holocaust and occupation atrocities. Internationally, the SS became a symbol of totalitarianism and the dangers of ideological militarization. In popular culture, the black uniform and insignia of the SS came to represent absolute submission to power, the transformation of the soldier into an agent of ideology. This universal association helped fix the SS as the moral antithesis of legitimate military service, reinforcing the lesson that technical skill without ethical constraint leads to destruction. Within Germany, the confrontation with this past became central to national self-understanding. In the 1980s and 1990s, exhibitions such as The Crimes of the Wehrmacht, Wehrmachtsausstellung, challenged public assumptions by displaying photographic evidence of army involvement in mass murder. The debate it provoked marked a turning point in German memory culture. It forced society to acknowledge that the SS and Wehrmacht had not been separate moral entities, but participants in a shared project of conquest and annihilation. This recognition did not erase differences in function or motivation, but it revealed a structural unity. Both served a regime that had subordinated law, ethics, and strategy to racial ideology. The rivalry between the SS and the Wehrmacht, therefore, was not merely an internal contest for influence. It illustrated how totalitarian systems dissolve institutional boundaries to maintain control. Hitler's method of divide and rule ensured that neither force could achieve full autonomy, yet it also guaranteed systemic inefficiency and eventual collapse. The Wehrmacht's professionalism without political independence became impotence. The SS's ideological purity without strategic sense became self-destruction. Together, they formed a machine that consumed itself through obedience. In a broader sense, their relationship shaped post-war debates on civil-military relations, the limits of obedience, and the moral responsibility of soldiers. The defense of following orders, often invoked by both Wehrmacht and SS officers during trials, became a central question in international law and military ethics. The Nuremberg Principles and subsequent Geneva Conventions redefined individual accountability, emphasizing that legality does not absolve moral responsibility. The German experience and the collapse of the distinction between professional and ideological warfare became a warning for all modern states. Today, historians view the SS-Wehrmacht conflict as a microcosm of the Third Reich's internal contradictions, the coexistence of bureaucratic order and ideological chaos, of technical efficiency and moral collapse. It demonstrates that the destruction of institutional independence in favor of political loyalty inevitably undermines the very purpose of a military organization. The Wehrmacht's submission and the SS's fanaticism were two stages of the same process, the subordination of reason to belief. The end of the war did not erase this legacy. It transformed it into a permanent question for modern history. How can societies prevent ideology from replacing ethics in the institutions that wield power? The story of the SS and the Wehrmacht offers no simple answer, but it remains a cautionary example that when the sword and the creed become one, when loyalty eclipses conscience, a state may gain absolute control, only to destroy itself from within.